Welcome to the next video. I want to talk about Donald Trump Jr.'s speech at the Republican National Convention. Now, he comes up with many lines of attack against the Democrats and Joe Biden. Now, I'd like to say that my opinion is many of the attacks he did choose to go with are actually not completely based on factual information. There's definitely some misleading claims in there. Now, take it from me, there are plenty of reasonable attacks and criticisms of Democrats. There's lots of things you can go into. Although I don't think that Don Jr. necessarily hits those points in his speech. So he goes in a different direction. Let's try to break apart the bits. We'll listen a little and I'll commentate on it as we go through the video.
Good evening, America. I'm Donald Trump Jr. We're here tonight to talk about the great American story, to talk about this country we all love, this land of promise and opportunity, of heroes and greatness. Just a few short months ago, we were seeing the American dream become a reality for more of our citizens than ever before. The greatest prolonged economic expansion in American history.
Okay, concerning economic expansion. Now, you do have to grant that coming off of the Obama years, the trend was going upwards and towards growth. So, President Donald Trump did inherit a strong economy based on things like stock market and unemployment levels and such. Now, as far as quality of jobs, you could say that the quality of jobs did not completely recover, basically coming off of Obama's years after repairing the collapse during George W. Bush. That's a fair criticism. He doesn't go into that here. He says that the great economy is created by President Trump. Now, it's true that stock market has record highs right at the moment, okay? But that is due to the Federal Reserve pumping money into the markets, as well as the sort of attitude that this Republican president or Trumpian president, President Trump, will do anything to keep the market up and the economy running, at least through election. So he's done a lot of kind of coercion and intimidation at the Fed to try to make sure they keep pumping money into the stock market to at least keep that going well. Because if we do have a crash, that's when the real layoffs may come. And you can't pump money into the market forever. Eventually, it catches up to you. It's fake money. But perhaps he's trying to delay it, at least for now. I wouldn't say the economy is terrible now, but the president did inherit a growing economy. And you can't say that it was just created out of thin air. That would not be accurate. Let's listen some more.
The lowest unemployment rate in nearly 50 years. The lowest unemployment rates ever for Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, women, and pretty much every other Democrat.
The unemployment rates were at relative all-time lows coming off of Obama. And President Trump may have built on that a little bit recently due to coronavirus and such, and the whole handling and the not being able to contain that. Obviously, employment rates are now bad, although they've bounced somewhat back. Some of those furloughed workers may turn into permanently laid off folks, and only time is going to tell how much more of a bounce back we get.
Graphic group. And then, courtesy of the Chinese Communist Party, the virus struck. The president quickly took action and shut down travel from China. Joe Biden and his Democrat allies called my father a racist and a xenophobe for doing it. They put political correctness ahead of the safety and security of the American people. Fortunately, as the virus began to spread, the president acted quickly and ensured ventilators got to hospitals that needed them most.
Now, for the coronavirus response. Okay, so it is pretty clear that most politicians did not take it seriously in the beginning. That's granted. Democrats, Republicans alike. That's understood. It was not correctly figured out about what to do and how to take it seriously. Many people thought it would blow over. Eventually, there came a time when it was clear that it's going to keep getting worse without intervention. And that came at some point a few months in as our death toll started to rise and as the infection started to accelerate. Now, closing the border in general, right, step in the right direction, as well as kind of if we had a way to screen people coming in, that would be good. Now, the one issue here, though, is that just closing a border and doing no other steps, instead calling the virus a hoax, obviously doesn't help. There's also one other piece of information is they often try to pawn the blame off on China, for example, for the coronavirus. Now, many people have suggested that the WHO, the World Health Organization, was concealing information on behalf of their government, right? But the case is, early on in the pandemic, when we were still calling it a hoax here in the United States, the WHO did say that coronavirus is the #1 threat to humanity. They had their conference, they had their meetings, and it was announced to all other countries that this should be the top priority for the global health of the world, above everything else temporarily. More important than climate change, more important than nuclear disaster or any of that other threats to mankind. Was considered #1, and we continued to wait a month or a month and a half before doing any more actions beyond that. So we did receive a message that it was bad and chose to ignore it. Now, you can't have it both ways. You can't say it was their fault for letting it in here into America, but then also say that they didn't tell us, right? So they did inform at some point. It may not have been as quickly as everybody would have liked, but they did inform that it was bad, and we chose to ignore. So if you distrust their information, then it's just contradictory. You can't distrust it, and then let it come in, and then say they didn't tell us. When they did tell you, you just didn't trust the information. So the whole logic kind of falls apart in that case.
He delivered PPE to our brave frontline workers, and he rallied the mighty American private sector to tackle this new challenge. There's more work to do, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Job gains are outpacing what the so-called experts expected.
I think no matter how you phrase it, it's hard to justify the 170,000 plus deaths as a job well done. So I think the best you could do is to kind of try to brush it aside and talk about other issues. I don't think this can be a winning issue for the administration at this point. So because it hasn't been handled well. I mean, you can't tell how somebody else would have handled it. Fine, that's fair enough. That's a fair argument. We don't know how a President Hillary Clinton or a President Biden would have handled it in the early days. Now, they would have never called it a hoax. There would have been some action, but fair enough. Perhaps some of this mess is inevitable. That's understandable. But when you can't measure the other outcome, you can't measure against it and say that you're better, especially with so many deaths.
But Biden's radical left-wing policies would stop our economic recovery cold. He's already talking about shutting the country down again. It's madness. Democrats claim to be for workers, but they've spent the entire pandemic trying to sneak a tax break for millionaires in Democrat states into the COVID relief bill. Then they
The COVID relief bill did include subsidies of basically easily forgivable loans for big corporations. That part was supported by Republicans. And so at some point you kind of have to go along with it, right? I mean, everyone in the room, a lot of the people probably were complicit in going along with it because certain people are pushing for it. And you can't delay the bill forever. That looks bad. But also you have to fight to have some accountability for the funds, but you can't wait for several months. So it's complicated there, but definitely there was support of the the relief directly to the tops of businesses rather than to individuals. Although there was the one-time relief check that did go out. And I think possibly another relief check is on the way. I'm not sure.
They attacked my father for suspending the payroll tax for middle-class workers. In fact, if you think about it, Joe Biden's entire economic plan.
The payroll tax is problematic because if you do suspend that indefinitely, you do cause Social Security to have no funding mechanism, meaning that program will end. So the criticism there, I believe, came from the fact that the president suggested getting rid of it forever, kind of. I mean, don't suggest that if you don't mean that. Otherwise, you're going to be open to attack as wanting to defund Social Security. So, I mean, don't make that argument if it's not your argument. That's the case.
Platform seems designed to crush the working man and woman. He supported the worst trade deals in the history of the planet. He voted for the NAFTA nightmare. Down the tubes went our auto industry. He pushed for TPP. Goodbye, manufacturing jobs. Beijing Biden is so weak on.
On one hand, the trade deals do outsource lower paying jobs to other countries. They boost American economy in general and American business because of lower cost. They do displace people as well. Now, however, ideally, you would have a strong set of jobs to provide to Americans. So I think if you want to boost general American business through something like NAFTA, you would have a more nuanced approach to what you allow to outsource and what you do not allow to outsource. And that way somehow can not obliterate all jobs at home, but gain benefits that trade deals would provide to a country. Because if we want to continue expanding as the U.S., we do need to be open to the competitive forces in the world. We cannot close up like a hermit kingdom. That would not benefit us in the long term. We would fall behind.
China, that the intelligence community recently assessed that the Chinese Communist Party favors Biden. They know he'll weaken us both economically and on a world stage.
The attacks by the Republican Party against China are comparable to the Democratic attacks against Russia. So they've both chosen a scapegoat to blame a lot of other problems on, in which case it's kind of like they're both playing the game of trying to pawn off our issues at home on somebody else, like if they have a tremendous influence over what happens here, when in fact it's our own policies which do a lot of these things to us.
Also wants to bring in more illegal immigrants to take jobs from American citizens. His open border policies would drive wages down for Americans at a time when
there's no open border policy. That's not even close to accurate.
Low-income workers were getting real wage increases for the first time in modern history.
Low-income workers don't get a wage increase unless you increase the minimum wage, because there's no incentive to pay the low-income workers anymore. The business will go with the minimum cost by paying their workers the minimum, whatever's allowed. So you get rid of the minimum and it would fall through the wage would fall through the floor. You raise the minimum, that would raise their wage. But if you leave it alone, their wage will not grow. In fact, it will fall in real dollars because of inflation.
Pledged to repeal the Trump tax cuts, which were the biggest in our country. After 8 years of Obama and Biden's slow growth, Trump's policies have been like rocket fuel to the economy, and especially to the middle class. Biden has promised to take that money back out of your pocket and keep it in the swamp. That makes sense, though, considering Joe Biden is basically the Loch Ness Monster of the swamp.
The criticisms of swamp don't really work because they're both sided. So if you say Biden is the swamp, well, Trump surrounded himself and his administration with the swamp as well. He is not cleared the swamp. Believe it or not, I mean, despite the rhetoric, they're both swamp. They're both corporatist, basically. Trump had a fake populism. He used it to connect with a lot of voters, but it was a fake populism because he surrounded himself with the swamp and continued doing what the swamp wants. He had all Goldman Sachs executives as like his main financial advisors.
For the past half century, he's been lurking around in there. He sticks his head up every now and then to run for president. Then he disappears and doesn't do much in between. So if you're looking for hope, look to the man who did what the failed Obama-Biden administration never could do and built the greatest economy our country has ever seen. And President Trump will do it again. We will be stronger than ever because when we put our mind to it, there is no obstacle that America can't surmount. Except
there was a lot of chatter on Twitter about this speech because based on the energy that Donald Jr. had, as well as kind of the glistening of his eyes, perhaps the lighting, there was a suggestion that he maybe have taken Adderall or cocaine even to give the speech. Now, he certainly gets very animated and few breathy portions. It could just be enthusiasm, but the internet mocked him and did quite a job of dragging him through the fires to suggest he was maybe on Adderall.
There's a difference this time. In the past, both parties believed in the goodness of America. We agreed on where we wanted to go. We just disagreed on how to get there. This time, the other party is attacking the very principles on which our nation was founded. Freedom of thought, freedom of speech.
Now, about the divisiveness, you can't say that the President Trump has not been divisive. That's been the dividing factor of setting people apart, separating them, especially into groups, and making them fight each other. Now, sure, identity politics, which the left does engage in, can contribute a little, but recently, with all of the kind of partisanship coming from the current president, it eclipses even the effects that identity politics would have.
Speech, freedom of religion, the rule of law. Thomas Jefferson famously said, "I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man." Our founders believed there was nothing more important than protecting our God-given right to think for ourselves. Now, the left...
I would say the criticism of cancel culture and the attack on freedom of speech is legitimate because it does go too far in some cases. But if you're going to promote toxic ideas, you should expect backlash because that's how people will react. Freedom of speech doesn't protect you from being criticized. It protects you to express your thought. And then if everyone hates the thought, it will jump on you. And that's not you being canceled. That's you being criticized, which is the other person's freedom of thought.
They're trying to cancel all of those founders. They don't seem to understand this important principle. In order to improve in the future, we must learn from our past, not erase it. So we're not going to tear down monuments and forget the people who built our great nation. Instead, we will learn from our past so we don't repeat any mistakes. And we will work tirelessly to improve the lives of all Americans. Joe Biden and the radical left are now coming for our freedom of speech. They want to bully us into submission. If they get their way, it will no longer be the silent majority. It will be the silenced majority. This has to stop. Freedom of expression used to be a liberal value, at least before the radical left took over. Now the Republican Party is the home of...
The frequent mention of radical left is not really accurate whatsoever. So our political system is very interesting here. We have a left side, right side, and there's, you'd say, middle, right? Middle. But the case is we actually have a right-leaning party and a center-right-leaning party. If you look at the spectrum, we have left is here on the screen, right is here. but both parties are actually on this side of the spectrum. The two choices are between these. We're not choosing a left party at the moment because both parties are corporatist parties. So the idea that the Democrats are radical left is simply not true. They're not effective in some ways because they're not a left party, at least modern day. They're more like 1980s Republicans.
Free speech, the place where anyone from any background can speak their mind, and may the best ideas win. People of faith are under attack. You're not allowed to go to church, but mass chaos in the streets gets a pass. It's almost like this election is shaping up to be church, work, and school versus rioting, looting, and vandalism.
There certainly has been some hypocrisy with the rules around the protests, around coronavirus. The hypocrisy certainly exists in some cases. Concerning the protests, if you say that all the protesters are violent, then you're also admitting that you can say that all cops are violent. And that's not true. All cops are not violent, right? Our classification is usually that most are good people. Same idea. When you look at the protests, the numbers, they show that most of the protests are good. The problem is the really bad situations where you have the agitators mixed in, those get reported on and make the headlines, and then make the clips on TV that you see that are meant to scare people. So in those cases, yes, the violent aspects of those should be taken care of and properly handled according to the law and handled by the police department. That's true.
Or, in the words of Biden and the Democrats, peaceful protesting. Anarchists have been flooding our streets.
So both sides are doing that, are kind of doing that trick where some people are suggesting that the problem is the majority of cops, and some people are suggesting the problem is the majority of protesters. And in both cases, it's actually like, well, you have to find out ways to handle the cases where there are the few bad cops and the few bad agitators in the protests.
And Democrat mayors are ordering the police to stand down. Small businesses across America, many of them minority-owned, are being torched by mobs. The Democrat mayors pretend it's not happening. They actually called it a summer of love. And that brings me to another important principle. Every American must be free to live without fear of violence in your country, in your communities, and in your homes. All men and women are created equal and must be treated equally under the law. That's why we must put an end to racism, and we must ensure that any police officer who abuses their powers is held accountable. What happened to George Floyd is a disgrace, and if you know a police officer, you know they agree with that too. But we cannot lose sight of the fact that our police are American heroes. They deserve our deepest appreciation because no matter.
So he's doing it here. He's suggesting that most police are good. That's true, right? Everybody knows police who have the best of intentions. And then he says that all the protesters are bad. So it's the hypocrisy 100%. Like, he chose the side that he wants to politicize, and he did politicize that side.
No matter what the Democrats say, you and I both know when we dial 911, we don't want it going to voicemail. So defunding the police is not an option. Everything starts with safety and security. You can't have anything else without it. You can't focus on building a better future for your children without the people.
I think the terminology defund the police is a poor choice of terminology because it's never meant to eliminate the police department. But I think each of those improvements or suggestions for how it would be handled differently should be looked at closely and considered. And but nobody's going to rush to immediately make any of those changes, despite the way it's being reported on. There's always going to be a police department, whether you call it the police or you call it something else.
Peace of mind that they can study safely in their classrooms, play safely in their neighborhoods, and sleep safely in their beds. But safety is only the beginning. Trump's America is a land of opportunity, a place of promise. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a family that could afford the best schools and the finest universities. But a great education cannot be the exclusive right of the rich and powerful. It must be accessible to all. And that's why my dad is pro-school choice. That's why he's called education access the civil rights issue, not just of our time, but of all time.
One issue, you can't consider school choice as being the education access option, making it, because if you want to provide, well, see, this is political words. If you say access, you mean that someone can pay for it if they have the money, right? So if that's the case, well, yeah, sure. School choice lets people who want to pay that amount or can get that choice. But if you can't afford that choice, you don't get that choice, and you have to go with the public school. In which case, if the public school is not good, because you get the bad choice then, because you happen to not be able to afford the better choice. So that's the area where people would say are debating, where they think having a quality education is something that people deserve to have, regardless of if they have all of the extra money to pay for it. They should have some amount of subsidized public education, because the public education system we have now is the free system. Now, the issue is when those systems are bad, like, I would suggest we should try to improve those systems, right? You can offer private schools as well. Just got to make sure you don't go to the extent where the private schools are going to replace the public schools. If we go that far, then there's people who can't get an education whatsoever, because they may not be of the means or ability to pay for it.
It is unacceptable that too many African American and Hispanic American children are stuck in bad schools just because of their zip code. Donald Trump will not stand for it. If Democrats really wanted to help minorities and underserved communities, instead of bowing to big money union bosses, they'd let parents choose what school is best for their kids. They'd limit immigration to protect American workers. They'd support the police who protect our neighborhoods. They'd learn how to negotiate trade deals that prioritize America's interests for a change. They'd end the endless wars and quit sending our young people to solve problems in foreign.
So concerning the America First idea, to an extent, that is understandable. But if you shut down completely, America will fall behind as a country competitively with the world. If we want to take a back seat to the world, we should close up and only focus on ourselves. Now, that would, in general, boost in some ways, boost our ability to provide for each other, right? At the same time, we lose our world leader sort of status.
Foreign lands. They'd cut taxes for families and workers. They'd create opportunity zones that drive investment into inner cities. In other words, if Democrats cared for the forgotten men and women of our country, they'd do exactly what President Trump is doing. America is the greatest country on earth, but my father's entire worldview revolves around the idea that we can always do even better. Imagine the life you want to have, one with a great job, a beautiful home, a perfect family. You can have it. Imagine the country you want to live in, one with true equal opportunity, where hard work pays off and justice is served with compassion and without partiality. You can have it. Imagine a world where the evils of communism and radical Islamic terrorism are not given a chance to spread, where heroes are celebrated and the good guys win. You can have it. That is the life. That is the country. That is the world that Donald Trump and the Republican Party are after. And yes, you can have it. Because unlike Joe Biden and the radical left Democrats, our party is open to everyone. It starts by rejecting radicals who want to drag us into the dark and embracing the man who represents a bright and beautiful future for all. It starts by re-electing Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. Thank you, and God bless America.
One of the arguments it's hard to make is that all of these promises he made at the end about all these things you can have, well, you've had 4 years to make that a reality. And people will judge whether or not they think that has come to pass or whether or not they think we're trending in that direction. And then they will vote and make their decision.